All right, man. Welcome to Crrow777 Radio. This is episode 481. Jason Lingren is with me, and we are happy to have Mike Williams with us. It's been a long time since I've talked with Mike. I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago, I had one of his videos in front of me, and it kind of persuaded me to steer Jason and I back on ground that we've covered now that so much detail is being brought forward. And that's kind of where Mike is. And I would say the same about the book called Chaos, which is about the Manson nonsense, the skit that rattled the world. So much detail is being laid down that it's for anyone who really wants to know how much nonsense we live through in culture. People like Mike, people like the book Chaos are putting the actual factual information out there that you know, it is what it is. But I will say that I think it was either 2012 or 2013 when I realized McCartney had been swapped out. And since that time, everything slowly started to change. But let's jump in here. Welcome, Jason.
Wow, and a very lovely good morning.
Hey, welcome, Mike. It's good to have you on, man.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for having me on the show.
Let's start with a couple blunt questions. Is it your view, if we were to look at the whole, let's just start with the British bands, the big British bands from the 60s that went into the 70s, do you think any of them are free of the kind of Tavistockian construct that the Beatles have been shown to be?
No. The entire British invasion, along with all the other genres of music that followed, are all inventions of Tavistock and the social scientists that all come in under the umbrella of the Committee of 300.
So that's funny you should mention that. I don't know. It was a long time ago when I first read that book. I think that was published, in the 80s or something? Maybe in the early 90s?
First edition, you're talking about the John Coleman book?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was either the late 80s or around the early 1990s. So it's about 35 years ago or so.
If I'm remembering, he was writing in the 80s and he had a couple other things, but I think it was 91 or 92. And it wasn't too long after that I first read it. And he flat out smacks it down right there and then. He makes just open statements about the Tavistockian constructions, but it's tame. He doesn't say everybody. But, I have been saying for years, the British invasion was exactly that. What's your opinion of how do you deal with it before we start getting into it? Because I know you were a big Beatles guy. I was certainly a big Beatles guy. How has it shifted your thinking about how you consume music and how you conduct your entertainment portion of your life?
Well, I don't listen to a lot of music anymore, Crow, as far as what I used to listen to. My work has taken the luster off of the Beatles and many, many other bands. In fact, I just released a playlist of 100 independent artists, and these are all folks that are subscribed to my YouTube channel. And so I would much prefer to listen to independent artists because that's real creativity. That's not a mock-up. That's not loaded up with ghostwriters and all of that stuff. So when I first got into the whole Beatles conspiracy, the McCartney conspiracy, it was a tough pill to swallow. As I've mentioned on many, many shows, I was a huge, huge Beatle freak. It's because of the Beatles that I picked up the guitar. It's because of them that I started writing music, recording music, and learned how to put a song together. But as I was going through the process of doing the research, I started to dismantle it. And so today, the way I look at it is there were a lot of great songs. There's no question about it, because we had some extremely competent people writing the songs, and they had studio musicians and players recording the music, especially, I'm talking about the Beatles specifically here, between 1962 and 66. From 1967 on, the Billy period, Billy Shears, 67 through 70, the Beatles, specifically John Lennon and George Harrison, were writing more of their own music and playing more on the recorded tracks, but the Beatles were still using studio players and ghostwriters. So, when I listen to it today, I listen to it knowing what's underneath it all. And so that level of excitement, that level of being really drawn to the music, it's just not there anymore. And quite frankly, I really haven't listened to a lot of Beatles stuff or even solo stuff in quite a while, a long time.
I think when it all started to fall into place for me, when I really realized, not only was something wrong here, but look, they swapped out one of the most popular people in the world right in front of your eyes. When you get to that last Beatles thing where they're on the roof, it starts to make perfect sense. They really needed a world-class keyboardist there, didn't they? And I've also wondered if, since his name was Billy, that they were worried it was getting out or something. But when you look back on it, it's almost like, how did we buy all this? I mean, what do you think when you look at Billy playing keyboards with the last Beatles? I mean, they kind of had to have that there, didn't they?
Yeah. So the Get Back sessions were the entire month of January. And the premise, we have to remember the premise of Let It Be, well, the Get Back sessions. They were supposed to come in, I think it was 12 to 14 new songs, write, rehearse, and record them within 2 weeks. And then right after that, they were going to do a live concert, and that was going to lead to a TV special. None of that transpired. In fact, when they showed up at the Twickenham studios, it was nothing but a vacant warehouse. They didn't even have a recorder there. And so the first thing you have to ask yourself as you're watching this and you're taking it in, so what you have to do, folks, is you have to strip away all of the conditioning of just being enamored with the Beatles, because that's all a fictional account. It's what I refer to as the Cinderella story. And you have to get down to basics. So they're there to record a new album, brand new material, coming in, we're told, basically with not a whole lot of backlog, and they couldn't do it. And so the 2 weeks became a month. And after the 30 days, they were on a rooftop playing to who? To nobody. And they did 5 songs on the rooftop. A couple of them, they did 2 or so takes. And then what a lot of people don't know is that after the Get Back sessions, after the month of January had expired, they were still working on the songs. So it wasn't, Let It Be was not recorded within that 30-day period of time. There were songs that went through the rest of the year, and some of the songs were finished up in the early part of 1970. So some of those songs 1 year later is when they were finished. So as an example, the song I Me Mine, George Harrison had about 1.5 minutes of that song. The way we got to whatever the song is today, 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes, is Phil Spector did his producer wizardry behind the scenes. In the Get Back documentary by Peter Jackson's film, they made a statement in there that there was a version of Don't Let Me Down that was the version that wound up on the album. The album that we're talking about would be the Hey Jude album, because it was left off of Let It Be. And the truth of the matter is that that wasn't quite right. The vocal was redone afterwards by John Lennon. And it was interesting. I had called that out in a video, and it was maybe a couple of weeks after that, Peter Jackson was doing an interview with 2 fellows. I don't remember the name of the channel and all that stuff. And he had to explain, they actually did have to do the vocal afterwards, do it over again. It's the same thing with For You, Blue. George Harrison had to come back and redo the vocal for that. I think Ringo added the drums to Long and Winding Road sometime in the early part of 1970. Billy replaced John Lennon's bass track on Let It Be. And we never really do get to see Long and Winding Road and the song Let It Be during the Get Back sessions. This stuff was, I'm convinced, was done afterwards. So the point I'm trying to make is there's a whole lot of production. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes that the public is not shown. And that's to give the illusion of all of this magic that the Beatles had, and quite frankly, a lot of these other bands, the Rolling Stones included, because they were another creation of Tavistock. So the reason why I'm going through this with Let It Be, the Get Back sessions, is because that was a moment in time when we were supposedly being shown the creative genius of the Beatles, writing, rehearsing, and recording all of these songs. And we didn't see that. And in fact, for a band that had been around, we'll say 1962, by the time they got to 1969, they had all of their previous LPs under their belt. We have been told over and over again that they were just brilliant songwriters, magical, able to do whatever it is that they need to do because they were the Beatles. And what Let It Be shows us, what I tell people is what the Let It Be or the Get Back sessions showed us or showed me was what it is they could not accomplish.
So I know Jason's going to want to get on this, and I have so many questions, but
Yeah.
I had some notes that I wrote down the other day when I was watching a couple of the things that you recently put out. And I'm sure you've seen it because I know you've seen more than I have because of the detailed nature of the work you do. Here's the thing. At first, like years ago, when I realized it was all a put up, I started hating on the Beatles. Well, those bastards, look what they did to me. But when I came back down to earth and I realized, yeah, these guys are a Tavistock construction. Look how young they were when they got roped into this, not old enough to
Right.
make sound decisions. And I started to realize, I'm not the only victim here. What most of those lives have been. And then I saw a clip of George Harrison, and they were asking him questions. And he said, I was sleeping, I was daydreaming, and I woke up. And the interviewer asked, when was that? And he said, 1966. And of course, there's the double entendre there. Supposedly, everyone's going to think that the original McCartney dies or gets replaced, however it goes, in 66. But my question is, what I started to think was, were they like MK Ultra? I've heard a number of times when Harrison is interviewed where he would say things like, it's hard enough to pretend to be myself. And it almost feels like they were mind warped when they were young. And he's saying, I snapped out of it at some point. Do you think there's any there?
Yeah. So before I get to there, let me just also mention, I want to answer your question about Billy Preston coming in. Billy Preston, in my mind, was brought in intentionally in order to put more structure into the Get Back and Let It Be sessions, because it is when Preston showed up that the whole thing picked up. I mean, he really brought in that kick that they needed during those sessions. So I want to make sure I answer your question.
The professional glue. They needed some professional glue.
Yes, and Billy Preston was a professional studio musician. I mean, in Get Back, they make it sound like he was just their buddy. He showed up on a lark and he set up his Fender Rhodes piano and he decided to sit down and play with him. I don't think that that's the case at all. I think Billy made a phone call.
Just so everyone's listening, Billy Preston was considered a savant on the keyboards. I mean, like world class, just so everybody knows.
Right.
For people who haven't followed, he's the African-American man who sat in on the last bit of Beatles on the Roof stuff we're ever going to see. And I'm with you, Mike. They brought in a gunslinger.
Yeah. In order to get things going. Now, as far as the Beatles being MK Ultra, mind controlled, okay. I have said going back a couple of years ago, in fact, I have it in my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music?, where I highly suspected that this was the case. And the reason why I say that is because we have images of George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon with bird cages. And bird cages, they are Illuminati symbolism for mind control. So, because we have to ask ourselves, why do we have images on the internet of George Harrison and Paul McCartney, their heads inside a bird cage? And then we have other images of John Lennon where he has his head next to a bird cage and he has a Superman shirt on. Okay. And this goes back, the whole Superman thing goes back to the creation of the Übermensch, the superhuman, Nietzsche and all of that stuff. So I have suspected that they were in mind control programs at an early age, maybe going back into their teens. It could have went before that time. If anybody goes back and takes a look into the history of John Lennon's childhood, it was incredibly dysfunctional. To me, when I read that and knowing what I know about how a lot of these people get into these programs, his childhood is ripe to make him a candidate to bring him in. So I think it's possible, Crow and Jason, that they were in mind control programs and they were groomed and handled. And, they weren't aware of all of that grooming and handling. I mean, that's typically how it works. But Tavistock had them on the radar. And so when it was time, they brought them in, because what Tavistock does and what the deep state does is, they scour the landscape. They have their seeds planted everywhere. And they had the Beatles earmarked to do what they did.
It feels to me a little bit like what Manson has turned out to be on the tail of all the work that's now been done. But to get back to the point, I don't know this. I went through all kinds of feelings because music was like more than half of my life when I was young. I picked up a guitar for the same reasons you did. it was a very important part of my life. And when all this started falling apart, at first, those bastards, I hated the Beatles. And then after a while, I began to realize, wait a minute, maybe these guys are victims far beyond what happened to me. But then I look at Paul McCartney, when his book, I think Billy's Back was the version I got or something like that,
Yeah.
a few years ago. And I started falling back into that smug SOB and this and that. And then I started coming to earth and thinking, man, that's got to be a tough life to live. What Billy, the new Paul McCartney. If we say Billy Shears, just so everybody knows, we're talking about the replacement Paul McCartney.
Right.
What do you think? I mean, that's got to be a tough life, doesn't it?
It is a tough life. And in the memoirs and Billy's Back, Billy Shears will tell you that he made a lot of sacrifices. But in a way, it's hard to sympathize because along with these sacrifices, he has achieved significant amounts of wealth and influence. His role, once he took over the Beatles, and I believe he was behind the scenes prior to when he took the reins in the fall of 1966, was to really kick off the counterculture and to fundamentally change the very fabric of our society and our cultures, which essentially means to take down traditional values, to ensure that institutionalized religions, in particular Christianity, was dismantled, and so on. So on one hand, Billy's asking for sympathy, but on the other hand, he was well aware of what it is that he was in place to do. Where I do have some sympathy, or at least I should say some understanding, is that the world of those that are within the pyramid of power is very, very different than our world. So the way they are raised, the way they are brought up, the way they are handled and groomed and so on, this is something that the average person outside of the pyramid of power has no understanding of. So in a way, that's all they know. It's like being in a cult. It's all they know. That's their world. That's how it works. So Billy tells us in memoirs that he was subjected to trauma-based mind control programs, and his earliest remembrance of such a program goes back to when he was 3 years old. He says he was mentored by Aleister Crowley, and Crowley died in 1947. Billy was born in 1937. So there's the 10 years that Billy was referring to. It's a different world, Crow. And to them, that's the world. They don't really understand ours. They play to ours. They benefit from ours by usurping our non-physical or spiritual energy, our consciousness, and also our physical energy, which comes in the form of spending money on their merchandise, their concerts, their albums, and so on. So sometimes it's a little difficult for me to have a lot of sympathy because, we're dealing with a situation where Billy is definitely part of the elite control system. And he has played a major, major role in the transformation of society. Aside from what he's telling us in the book, where there's a lot of revelation of method, I'll tip my hat to that. I'll give him a lot of credit for that. But on the other hand, he's still pushing their agenda forward. And I guess he wants to have his cake and eat it too, in a way.
Well, it's crazy, what you said. A couple things there is, could you point to a figure who changed culture in this world more than the Beatles? I mean, it's incalculable. And you're right. I do have some sympathy for people who are drafted in at such a young age. But, in Billy's Back, things like, oh, there's a girl who the original Paul got pregnant, tried to sue me. And I said, oh, take my DNA. It's not me. To hell with you. And this kind of callous attitude when in fact, he stepped in
right.
to fame, fortune, but none of the responsibility, I guess. But the religion comment you just made, what was it? It was the movie Michael about the archangel with John Travolta, which I've taken apart to show that it's the son, not an angel. But in that, the archangel is saying, oh, John and Paul, and they say, oh, you mean the apostles? And he looks at them and says, no, the Beatles.
Right.
That clever play, even the setup of the names, also cleverly put together. But I want to mention another thing that came out of the committee of 300. There's a man who's apparently a musical genius, apparently has a very high IQ, had. I think he died in 69. His name is Adorno. Some months ago, I was getting books, which I do. I collect books, and I found all of Adorno's essays in one book. And so I grabbed it. And it's astonishing the kind of musical level that he has a grasp of, but he is just bad mouthing popular music. And when I'm talking popular music, he died in 69. In the book Committee of 300 is kind of tilted towards Adorno. But then, as it turns out, some people that I've met over the years, because I do this for a living, are aware and actually nod their heads as much as they can to say Adorno played a role in that. What are your thoughts on Adorno? And by the way, when you read that book, I mean, he's got nothing good to say about the genre we're talking about.
Yeah, so Theodore Adorno was a social scientist, just like Willis Harman. And he, in my view, played a significant role with the Beatles, with the whole British invasion. But the Beatles were the first ones out of the chute. The Beatles were the first manufactured band, if you will. So a lot of attention, a lot of focus, a lot of resources went in behind the Beatles. And Adorno was an accomplished composer. And I know there are folks that want to argue with that say that, well, if you listen to his music, he did a lot of atonal music. So atonal music would be the kind of music you would hear in horror movies. You know, it's kind of, there's no tonal center, if you will.
I'm sorry, but that's called the 12 atonal scale, I believe, in the Committee of 300. Which I also want to talk to you about because you're a musician. But anyhow, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, that's okay. So Adorno, his philosophy was, to kind of oversimplify this thing, is that we live in a fascist system. And this system is oppressive. And human beings will never become enlightened or illuminated or unshackled. And his work was tied into the human potential movement, which is something that Willis Harman was deeply invested in. And one of the things that Adorno said, which to this day I won't forget, he said that humans, when they go to work, are producers, and when they're out of work, they are consumers. And so he didn't have any use really for the capitalist system. He thought that, as you mentioned, Crow, that pop music was just, it was just nonsense. And that human beings should be spending their time doing more constructive things. They should be philosophizing, being more creative, innovative, and so on. And he believed that the state had the means to take care of all of the basic needs so that humans can thrive. That, so if you take a look at what Adorno, like I said, folks, from a high level perspective, this is what he thought. Now, some people have said to me, well, if Adorno thought that pop music was rubbish, then why is it that he was involved in the Beatles music?
Exactly.
Right? Right. Well, the reason is because it's like climbing a ladder. It's like taking the stairs going up. What he did was he took the existing mainstream musical premise genres that are out there, and he leveraged it to continue to build it and build it and build it. So if you take the Beatles music as an example, so let's just say they start with Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. I mean, these are not extraordinarily difficult songs. But as time went on in short order, the Beatles were turning out far more sophisticated music. And in my opinion, this was the strategy of Adorno and George Martin, because I believe that both of them worked together. Martin was the day in and day out managing director of the Beatles' psychological operation. And Adorno was overseeing. Next question would be, well, there's information out there where some people said that Adorno wrote all of the Beatles' music. And I, in my big presentation, did the Beatles write all their own music? I cover this, and I said, I don't subscribe to Adorno writing all of their music. He was a very busy man doing a lot of other stuff, writing books and all of this. But that does not mean that he did not write some of the music. In fact, if you listen to the Beatles song Piggies on the White Album, that's Adorno's philosophy right there. That's his ideology captured in that song.
And implicated in Manson.
Yes. Yep. And in Baroque classical style. So did that come from George Harrison? No, that didn't come from George Harrison. What I tell folks is if you want to get a comparison between a song that I believe that George Harrison did write on the White Album would be Long, Long, Long. And then you listen to Piggies. No, these are two different composers. Okay. So that's what I believe Adorno did along with George Martin. They had to start basic, and then we see this exponential rise, this trajectory going from the first album, Please Please Me, to what they were putting out, starting with what I believe, I think the Help album with Rubber Soul and then Revolver, because this was during the Bio Paul period. We have this rise in sophistication in the music that, in my opinion, it defies reasonableness. Especially when we look at the Beatles, what were they before they were signed to EMI in June of 1962? They were a bar and club band. That's what they were. And according to George Martin, his own words, they showed no signs of being prolific songwriters. He said he thought their music was rubbish and they had nothing behind them. Initially, his job was to go find the music that they could record. There was an article in the Mercy Beat magazine, which was popular back in the day. It was, I think, the August-September 1962 edition. And the main purpose of the article was to say that Ringo replaced Pete Best, but also in that article it says that the Beatles were flying to London to record music that was written for them and given to them by their manager, their recording manager, their producer, George Martin. So we have to keep this within the context of the entire story, that when the Beatles first got started, when they first arrived in Hamburg in August of 1960, they were this young, inexperienced, rough around the edges bar and club band. And in fact, their first manager or handler, Alan Williams, before Brian Epstein stepped in, he had a difficult time getting them booked in Hamburg. And this story is told in the Complete Beatles documentary, which goes back to the 1980s, which was considered the Beatles documentary before Anthology was produced and released. So we have these guys going back into August of 1960. John's 20 years old, Paul's 18, George is 17. And then we're to expect that from August of 1960 to February 7th of 1964, when they land in America, that's 3.5 years. So how did this bar and club band that was young, inexperienced, and rough around the edges, showed no signs of songwriting, their musician skills were average at best, how did they go from their Hamburg stint, August 1960, to arriving in America, February 7th, 1964, 3.5 years? How did that happen? Is that organic? No, that's not organic. There was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. And we also have to remember that when they did their Decca audition, which was on January 1st of 1962, Decca declined to sign them. George Martin also declined them. And a lot of people don't realize this. A lot of people who follow the Beatles don't understand that George Martin did not want to sign the Beatles. He listened to the tape that Brian Epstein gave to him. He said, not interested. Memoirs tells us that George received a call from upstairs from a superior and said, wrong answer. You're going to sign these guys. And when George Martin did sign them, and we're told that contract was on June 18th of 1962, that's Bio Paul's birthday, that Martin didn't work with the Beatles one-on-one himself. He had delegated the work to an assistant, Ron Richards. And when it wasn't panning out, George received another phone call from a superior and said, okay, understand that there is no delegation. You have to work with them one-on-one. There's no delegating. So there's all of this stuff that was going behind the scenes that many Beatle fanatics, Beatle fans don't know, or if they do know, they just ignore it, because it's to not ignore it is problematic to the overall Cinderella story that the official narrative wants everybody to embrace.
Well, let's just make it clear. So any reasonable mind would say why, right? Why did Tavistock construct them? Why did the phone ring and tell Martin this is happening when he was clearly on a number of instances, he said they don't have that much talent.
Right.
There's nothing there. I mean, I think I'm aware of 3 or 4, even a more modern, what's that guy's name from Britain? I forget, a more modern interview, and they put a cut in. It almost seems to me in that interview that Martin might have went a little too far because there was a cut in an odd place. But the point I was going to make is they had a social engineering agenda. And I have stated in so many episodes, it is probably the most successful psychological operation of all time.
Yep.
Family unit was broken. Our moral values were broken. They were drugged out of their damn minds, as was my generation, as have so many generations since then, all the way to the point where now the pusher is a pharmaceutical company, all normalized because of the period of time. But if we go back to the 12 atonal, so I'm reading, I don't remember if it was in the Adorno book. I know there's a reference in the Committee of 300 by Coleman, but the implication of the 12 atonal is that this is unhelpful. This is not melodic, high-minded music. This is basement going the other direction. And so I got in a conversation with Jason about the 12 atonal scale, and he talked to the man who wrote the soundtrack to Shoot the Moon, who's a PhD in music. What is your take on the idea of the 12 atonal? I mean, it's almost like there's no common reference to whatever they meant when they said that back then.
Yeah, so Beatles music was not atonal, it's tonal. So I, in my presentation, did the Beatles write all their own music? I addressed this issue. So Coleman did not get it right. And I surmise that the reason why Dr. Coleman went off on that path is because I sensed that he was disgusted with where the music was going. He knew where it was going. He knew what the agenda was. And so he got off on this whole atonal.
It makes sense.
Bit, right?
Right.
So I that's what I think. So, but Beatles music is not atonal. It's tonal music. There's a couple of situations, songs where we might hear some atonal types of riffing, like at the end of Magical Mystery Tour, perhaps. An example of an avant-garde atonal type of construct would be Revolution Number 9, with all of these tape splices and bits all over the place. In other words, there's no real structure. It's a kind of a free-for-all. Anything kind of goes. That's not Beatle music. Beatle music is tonal. And that's where Coleman got it wrong.
And that's interesting, because the moment you said it, I remember thinking that very thing, that he was already prejudiced against the whole thing for more than one reason. Partially because his generation's music he considered much more musical and higher minded. But like you say, he knew what the agenda was. By the way, I have it on good authority from people who knew so many of the people that Coleman points to, who have said there's very little that he was talking about that didn't come to pass in that book. Just so anyone knows, if you want to read it, it's called The Committee of 300. I think that's it, right, Mike? By Coleman. And it's been out since a long time ago. But there's a few things here that I want to get. Maybe I should do them in an order that kind of makes sense.
What we should mention, though, Crow, is that because a lot of people, like whenever I talk about this stuff, they just want to say that Coleman is some kind of conspiracy nut job. Understand that the book on the Committee of 300 is not a book about the Beatles.
No, there's 2 or 3 pages that indirectly,
right.
Well, there's one paragraph that directly points a finger. All the rest of it is indirect references.
Right. So what happens is when you talk about the other content in Dr. Coleman's book, people in the alternative research community, the truth community, they're like, oh yeah, yep. Boy, that guy was, he had the score going back 35, 40 years ago. But as soon as you mention the Beatle aspects of it, they don't like that. Right. So the reason why I want to point this out is because the Committee of 300 is not a book about the Beatles. It's not John Coleman beating up on the Beatles. He's just bringing them in as part of what the Committee of 300 was doing and still doing to alter the fabric of our society and our culture.
Perfect. And there's another thing I'd mentioned there of, I don't want to say too much because I've been, people don't want to be publicly known for talking about such things. I had said to people in the know, how is it that Coleman could have even come by some of this information had he not been fed? And I was making the statement, I feel like he was involved in an early revelation of method. And the response I got back was indirect and mostly crickets in the room, just to put it
Yeah.
out there. But it's not really arguable that most of what he laid down, we can see it in reverse now. But there's an interesting thing, and I haven't heard you talk about it. Doesn't George Martin have a coat of arms that has like 3 Beatles on it?
I have to look at his coat of arms again, but I think you're correct. A couple of people have made mention of that. I haven't looked at his coat of arms very closely, but yeah, there's something about his coat of arms that would make you raise an eyebrow.
I was wondering if anyone knows that, did he have that before the Beatles? Because that'd be a tell. And that leads me into, it feels to me, and part of this is based on, I think the first book was called Billy's Back. I think I got like the first version before all the later updates.
Well, there's 2 books. The Memoirs of Billy Shears is the full-blown 666-page book. Billy's Back is the abridged version of Memoirs.
Well, the one I got has his back on the front, but it is a thick book.
I think Billy's Back is about 400 pages itself.
So in that, there's some allusions that everybody in the Tavistokian construct world, like the Stones or the Who, knew about the whole Paul thing, which of course they must have. They even point to songs. Oh, what do you think this song is about? But there's an underlying current, and you just mentioned that they got signed on biological Paul's birthday, and there's songs that make it feel like people knew this was coming. There's allusions to, oh, he had dreams, he knew he was going to die, but and you even mentioned Billy Shears, new Paul, may have well been around before old Paul goes away.
Right.
Do you get a sense that there was a plan from way back that we were swapping out original Paul, and if so, why?
Because it goes back to Crowley, and in Memoirs it tells us that in the footnotes, and I've got the 2022 version of Memoirs. I just finished rereading it, and so what folks have to understand is the world is run by occultists, so they're going to do their occult thing. So they go about identifying astrological events tied to dates, tied to gematria, tied to numerology, tied to tarot, all of this stuff. And so from reading Memoirs, what I got out of it was biological Paul McCartney. He had all the right criteria, which, what does that tell you? That tells you that he was on the radar, which tells me, and I'm not going to make, any allegations here, but I'm just saying this is my opinion, that one way or another, his family was tied into it. I believe that his father, Jim McCartney, was a Freemason, and that he may have been a big part of what was going to happen. A lot of times, they don't have the full story. They're given basically work streams to focus on. And his father would have had a particular work stream that he had to manage with regard to his son. The same thing with John Lennon. In fact, I had one person tell me, I have not been able to substantiate this, but I'll just tell you what this person told me, that the Harrisons were tied into American intelligence.
His sister lives in this country, does she not?
Yeah, I think she does. Yep.
Yeah.
So take that for what it's worth. And in Memoirs, it tells us that Ringo is very much connected, but they don't explain, the book doesn't explain the connection point. So going back to what you were saying, it's all based upon the occult. So I do believe, Crow and Jason, that the Beatles go back before 1962. At the very least, what I've said, at the very, very least, it goes back to when they got to Hamburg in August of 1960. And as I just mentioned earlier in our discussion, honestly, I think it goes back into their childhood. I think they were earmarked to do something.
How could it be any other thing? And I've always viewed the Hamburg as, here's your crash course. Here you're going to do long gigs day after day to get used to being in the public eye, on stage, all these things. Not only that, they're shaking out the band, right? Oh, that drummer's got to go, things are happening. Hamburg
was training. So the Beatles had to learn to crank it out and learn songs quickly. There's no better way to do that than to play them over and over and over again, day in and day out, every night. So the Beatles, they would wind up going to the Hamburg Club at 6 p.m. and they would leave sometime after 2 a.m. And I have an interview from Pete Best, and he said they would wake up at 3 p.m. and they'd have to be back at the Hamburg Club by 6 p.m. And I address this because a lot of people think that during the Hamburg days, they were sitting there writing music. original music, and they were not. So Hamburg was to get them conditioned to crank. That's so that when Tavistock threw the switch for Beatlemania, the Beatles would be able to go on these breakneck tours. You know, the Beatles would do 16 shows in 16 days, like the American tour before they did Rubber Soul. I think it was 16 shows in 16 different states. I think one stint was in Canada. 16 days it was. I mean, that's
Crazy.
taking into consideration travel, airplanes, buses, and all that stuff, and so on, right?
Yeah.
So the Beatles were taught the music that they took out on the road. So that's what Hamburg was about. Hamburg was about, okay, learning music because we're going to teach you more music. And then you're going to take the music that we teach you and you're going to take it out on the road. That's what you're going to do. So the Beatles were a veneer. Yeah, yes, yeah. Hamburg was boot camp. And aside from Hamburg, what a lot of people don't realize is in between their Hamburg stints, they were doing gigs just about every night, every day throughout the UK. Many times it was close to Liverpool, but they were doing some other stints where they had to do some traveling. But the point I'm trying to make is between their UK stints and their Hamburg, they were cranking and cranking and cranking. They had their head down, and it was in order to make them competent performers, not songwriters, because Tavistock already had their songwriters. They had to be competent performers.
The thing you're pointing out, Mike, is that when would these people have had time to write all these songs that went on these albums? Not to mention the fact that on the first couple of albums, there's a ton of covers to begin with.
Right. Well, they didn't have time, Jason. They didn't. And, when we go back and look at all the stories that we're told, maybe we'll get into Rubber Soul. I could take you through that. That Rubber Soul, as soon as I started watching that documentary, being a musician, a songwriter, and somebody who records myself, 20 minutes into it, I said, there's a big problem here. But even if we go back to their first album, Please Please Me, we're told that they recorded 10 songs in one day. Okay? Even the Decca demo, we're told that they did, I think it was 15 songs in several hours at Decca, 3 of which were nondescript originals. I think it was Like Dreamers Do, Hello Little Girl, and Love of the Love. I question that. We're told that they wrote 30 plus songs while they were out in India when they weren't all there at the same time in India. Ringo left after 2 or 3 weeks because he'd become ill. Billy left after about a month, 30 days, and George and John stayed for 60 days. And they went there with an entourage, which included their girlfriends and Donovan and others, right? So there were things that they were doing in India, activities and meditation and all that stuff. And then the one that really gets me is there's a story that, well, part of the Beatle legend is that it's the Esher demos. And we're told that on an unknown day in May of 1968. So I have no idea how everything else within the Beatle realm is documented. All the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, but we have no idea when it is that they went in and recorded 27 demos in one day at George Harrison's bungalow. And that's referred to as the Esher demos. And I think 19 of those songs, I'm trying to read some, if I'm missing some of these numbers, folks, just bear with me. Sometimes it's just so much information. But I think 19 of those songs ended up on the White Album.
Someone should call the Guinness Book of World Record, but the fact that they're on the White Album, I'm going to bring up the White Album. In other words, the White Album gets implicated into a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, the White Album, to me, is the first album where we hear more of their own compositions and more of them playing on the tracks, because you can hear a clear distinction between the musicianship that we hear in some of the songs in the White Album and the musicianship that we heard through the first 7 albums from Please Please Me to Revolver, the Bio Paul era, 1962 through 1966. To me, there's a big difference in the sound, big difference in the skill level on many of the songs.
Simpler songs while Bio Paul is there? Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I mean,
to play live?
I'm talking about just the skill level of the musicianship. Were some of the songs simple? Yes. That's the argument. A lot of people want to say, well, these are not hard songs to play. It doesn't matter whether they're hard songs to play. My point is how well they're being played. And the Beatles did not show any inclination to have that level of skill, musicianship-wise, to play at that level. Think about a song like Day Tripper and how that song begins, the riff, and then how the drums roll in. When have we ever heard Ringo Starr drum like that? One of the examples I use to really kind of draw it out for people so that they can do a comparison is go to John Lennon's first solo album, Plastic Ono Band, and listen to the song God, and listen to the drumming on God. That's Ringo. It's stiff. It's not fluid. I mean, does he do a good job? He does a decent job, but it is not the same drumming that we're hearing on the early period songs. George Martin himself, and the Beatles' official narrative tells us that Andy White was hired to drum on Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. And I have said that I find it very hard to believe that George Martin only hired Andy White, a session drummer, for those two songs. If I was a betting man, I would bet you that all of the drumming on the first album, Please Please Me, is Andy White. We've had Bernard Purdie step out starting in the late 1970s to say that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs. Bernard Purdie is one of the greatest session drummers of all time, one of the most recorded drummers of all time. He played for 25 years with Aretha Franklin. And I have people say, well, he's a liar. He's a liar. No, he's not a liar. He drummed on 21 songs. When I released my big presentation back in April of 2020, before that I had been dialoguing with a person. And it's one of those dialogues, email correspondences, where you know that that person knows a lot more than what they're saying. So after I released the presentation, they wrote me. And they said, well, Mike, now that the cat is out of the bag, let me just tell you this. I am related to Ronnie Verrill, the great session drummer out of the UK. Now, he passed away, and I guess it's got to be at least 10 years ago or so now. But she said that Ronnie drummed on Beatles songs too. And this person is a family member of Ronnie Verrill's. We have Bernard Purdie in an early 2000, I think it was 2004, it was a Red Bull sponsored interview. He came out and said that there were 4 drummers on the Beatles' music. And I believe Bernard was talking about the early period, 62 to 66. And he said, and Ringo was not one of them. So how many more people have got to step out and talk about this before people realize that the person telling you this is not the liar?
Right. Well, I got to jump in here. We're coming to the top of our
go ahead.
But what I have found is like the work that you're doing, you've gone into the nuts and bolts. You'll give you the damn day, the date, the name, the birth date. And what I have done is detected the fraud. And a lot of people who would like to hear Mike Williams' dates to even consider what I have said, do things like, well, yeah, that band, but not this other band that I love. You know, it's the mindset you're talking about. We're a nerd. We're quite married to these things that were the soundtrack of our young lives. But Mike, please tell folks where they can get a hold of your just awesome work. Are you primarily on YouTube at this point?
On YouTube, BitChute, Odyssey, all of them. So just go to my hub website, folks, Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY.com. All of the links are there. And whatever platform makes you happy, I'll be there.
All right. Just to be clear, it's Sage of, and the word Quay is spelled Quay. Now, when we get back, I have so many things. And Jason, I'm sorry I bogarted that. We're going to have to butt you in because I know you want to get in on this. I want to talk a little bit about the LSD because it's important to the Tavistokian ideas. I want to talk a little bit more that the death to come was known. And I think this is pointed out in the book where they're saying, oh, this song that everyone loves is talking about this. Ruby Tuesday, on it goes. A little bit about studio time, but I think there's a big story to be told from Harry Nilsson. Not too long ago, there was a whole movie made about his life, and he's on YouTube saying flat out that he was the 5th Beatle at times. Anyhow, with that, we're going to wrap up hour 1 of episode 481. We're going to take a very short break and come back for hour 2. So many things we could cover. Hour 1 is free to everybody at Crrow777radio.com, Crrow777radio.com. Members know to come in and log in for the full episode. With that, we're going to take a quick break, and I would like to wish everybody in the entire world a happy, healthy, and higher-minded new era. Cheers. All right, man. Welcome back to Crrow777 Radio. This is hour 2 of episode 481. Jason Lindgren is back with me, as is Mike Williams, also known online as the Sage of Quay. You probably search Sage of Quay to find him online. It's not hard to do. Welcome back, Jason. I'm just going to jump so we maximize the time. Mike, you had requested that we speak a minute about McGowan, and as so many people who follow here, at first I had real problems with McGowan. I mean, I appreciate everything that was laid down, and there were so many nuts and bolts that were definitively laid down that could be looked at and confirmed. But I was always irked at where the stop signs were put. Why didn't he go all the way? And so then later I started thinking maybe it wasn't safe. And then later I started thinking maybe he was warned. And then I started thinking, well, his death was kind of quick. Was that a natural death? But anyhow, let's pick up there. What did you want to say about McGowan?
Well, before we ended the first segment, Crow, we talked about where folks would say, well, maybe that band, but not my band.
Right.
Right. And we get that a lot. And I had mentioned, well, it's interesting because, Dave, who did tremendous work. Okay. So this is not in any way knocking Dave McGowan at all. But when he did his book on Laurel Canyon, he exposed so much of what the music industry, the music business, and these artists were all about, how they came about. But he wouldn't touch the Beatles. And so the question became, did he not touch the Beatles because he was told, don't touch the Beatles? Or was it because Dave's own belief system kept him from going there? That's the question.
Well, I can actually add something there. Now, I want to get your point of view on this. When I think of how this went down, I consider the British invasion side of the house absolutely demonstrable Tavistock construct and deep Tavistock construct. Now, when I come back over to Laurel Canyon, while I know it's all hand in hand and the messaging is synced one another, I consider that to be better described as military industrial complex, United States. Do you have that equivocation? How do you see the division that I'm pointing at? Do you agree with it?
I have a hard time these days, Crow, delineating between British intelligence, American intelligence. In my view, it's one and the same. For public consumption, we have them categorized, but they all work hand in hand. That's my view of it.
The messaging provably is in lockstep. There is no difference in the messaging.
Yeah, it's not like, well, American military intelligence just said, well, this is what we're going to do. And it just happened to coincide with what Tavistock was doing on the other side of the pond. No, these things are all coordinated.
Well, then we have the big red sore thumb called Manson, which intricately ties an event that was monumental in this country, the change, and even up to Tarantino's movie, still ringing that old crack bell. And it's implicated back to the Beatles work. And interestingly enough, I started out in law enforcement early on. Thank God I didn't. I almost became a police officer, but I was taking the courses, and lo and behold, when I get into criminal justice classes, what do they hand me that I have to write a report on? Helter Skelter. Now, this is written by a foul, dishonest man called Bugliosi, who is also the prosecutor, making a #1 bestseller as he prosecutes. But I don't want to go there. It's too much of a sidestep. So I'm going to try to quickly get into the things that I had listed. Now, I had mentioned that it feels to me like even biological Paul at some point probably knew he had to go. People point to the song Yesterday, Ruby Tuesday. That's done in the book. But I want to point a thing out. This gift never keeps giving, this mind warping. Now, I think, and you'll have to correct me because it's been a while since I read the first smaller of the books, apparently. The Who has a song called Don't Get Fooled Again, which is supposedly somehow tied to telling you the Paul is dead story. After 9/11, The Who came to New York City, and what did they play? We Won't Get Fooled Again. But do you think it was a known quantity? Do you think Paul really was having dreams that he was going to die? Did he die? Is he alive in the world somehow? Do you see where I'm going with all this?
Yeah. So if we take a look at what Memoirs tells us, it says that John Lennon and Paul McCartney entered into a Faustian bargain on October 24th of 1963, and that Paul was having these dreams or these nightmares, and it was tied to the Faustian bargain. So what they did was they released the Beatles' first LP, UK release. Those are the official releases. It's not the US Capitol releases. Please Please Me was released March 22nd, 1963. So we have the 322 there. And then this is what they usually do. They give you a taste of success and notoriety and celebrity. And then they ask the question, do you want more? And if you say, yeah, well, if you want more, then this is what you've got to do. And so the book tells us that the pact was made again on October 24th, 1963. It was that.
But just between them, Mike, I'm sorry, just between the two of them, supposedly?
Yeah, well, the book says it's between Lennon and McCartney. They both did it together. It doesn't mention George Harrison, and it doesn't mention Ringo Starr. It says the two of them. So Paul allegedly had these dreams or these nightmares. I think it was sometime mid-1965. And, they were tied into Kenneth Anger, as was the Stones and a lot of other bands. And
Zeppelin.
yeah, right. And Kenneth Anger was a disciple of Aleister Crowley. And in fact, some will say that the baton was passed from AC to Kenneth Anger. There was a reading that was done, I guess, some kind of reading that involved Anger and this guy by the name of Mosher, who was one of Anger's guys. They said, you don't have a lot of time left. So this is what's in the book. So that tells us that biological Paul knew that he had a problem. He entered into this Faustian bargain. He and Lennon were young guys, in all likelihood had no idea what it is that they were really getting themselves into.
Like a sacrifice, you mean? Someone's going?
Yeah. In other words, you give your life for the fame and fortune of the band. Your name becomes legendary and so on. And, when you're a young guy and these words are being spoken to you, what are you thinking? You're thinking that your life's going to be taken, or are you thinking that you're going to work really hard and do everything you can to make the band successful? So this is what's in the book. Now, there are going to be people that will say, oh, that's one of the fictional aspects of the book and so on. But, my research, and I'm sure your research and Jason's research has shown that these pacts are real. It's called going to the crossroads.
I can take it a step further. There is actually quotes from Robert Plant saying they did a similar thing. The only one who wasn't there from Zeppelin was John Paul Jones.
Right.
And John Paul Jones seemed to always be more aristocratic. He was definitely a musical phenom. To this day, he's a musical phenom. But it is claimed, and I saw it in print, Robert Plant said, I was just a stoned young singer. I had no business being involved in what Page was doing here.
Right.
Again, I've had conversations with Jason's my problem with Zeppelin. So you're a studio musician, which should put you almost like a gunslinger, like the studio bands that we talk about,
right.
The Wrecking Crew and stuff. That's supposedly what Page was. And then later, he can't write a song to save his life that matters. But then there's where Kenneth Anger comes in again. It is claimed that Anger and Page had a falling out during the making of a movie, and Anger hexed him and said, and is on the record as having said, you will never write another song that matters.
Right.
So let's move on from there. But I wanted to get your point of view. So there's a few things. Oh, this is what I want to get your. So I'm reasonably sure you probably watched the whole Get Back sessions. For people who don't know, the director and producer of Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson, magically gets all this magical Beatles footage that nobody possibly could have known existed, and he gets tasked with it. I have not seen the whole put together, but here's what I notice as a video editor and the psychological tricks that are used in video editing. And I don't know if it's the same as the full-blown version that I'm sure you've seen, but what I noticed was the quick cuts. In other words, there's a story that supposedly got filmed, and it's all cut apart. And there's all these bizarre quick cuts. And when I say quick cuts, one of the psychological tricks used in video editing is the human mind needs about 4 or 5 seconds to decide on a thing. When you see video that's cut apart in 1, 2, or 3 seconds, and it's done long enough, the brain just gives up and goes into zone mode because there's never been enough time to make a decision. That's what I noticed. But here's the thing. In the short little excerpts that I've seen that were released out on YouTube, I begin to ask, is that AI generated? Did you get any sense that that was constructed video? Did you ever have that thought?
Well, I watched the whole thing. And in fact, I did a lot of analysis of it. There's a researcher that I'm connected into that also had the same observations that you had, Crow, as far as the editing and all that stuff. What I noticed right off the bat, and some people are going to say, well, that's just because the technology has advanced. The pristine, the colors, how they just were just so much brighter, sharper, and all that stuff, right? So,
Yep,
okay,
yep.
that's fine. That's technology. Okay, I'll give you that. But it's very difficult to say whether deep fake was used. And the reason why is because deep fake is pretty advanced these days. In fact, I did a video where there's this guy on TikTok that does Tom Cruise. And I've watched that guy's videos over and over again. I'm like, I cannot believe this. I cannot tell that that's not Tom Cruise. So here's the thing. So if deep fake was used, and by the way, Peter Jackson, he's upfront about saying that incorporating artificial intelligence into his filmmaking is something that's what we're going to do. That is what we do.
Know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Yeah. So getting into AI and stuff like that. In fact, I did a video on before Get Back came out. I did a presentation about 2 hours long. And the reason why I did it was to remind everybody what the initial story was all about with Let It Be. And it was about a band that was coming apart at the seams, not this happy-go-lucky, back-slapping group of guys that were just having a great time during the sessions.
So your point, I'm sorry to interrupt, but for everyone listening, what Mike is pointing out is people that are my age, Mike's age, we remember discontent. Look, the band is falling apart. The whole perception by the Get Back sessions reverses that to convince us we were mistaken. That's what you're getting at, right?
Yeah, I mean, even though I'll give Peter credit, I mean, he left certain parts of the of footage in, like the elongated version of the terse discussion between Billy Shears, aka Paul McCartney, and George Harrison about what to play on guitar. But generally speaking, my takeaway was that Peter was tasked to buff it up. In other words, Billy wants the entire Beatle period to be bright and shiny. He wants it to be illuminated. And knowing that the original Let It Be film by Michael Lindsay Hogg, who was a director, did not put the Beatles in a bright light. Like we just said, Crow, it was a time when the Beatles were disintegrating. And that downward spiral, by the way, didn't start with Let It Be. It actually goes back to the White Album sessions. But in any case, that's what I think was the premise. The premise was to buff it up, buff that period up, make it shiny, make it look good. Don't make it look as dismal as it was presented back when the film came out in 1970.
Change perception.
Yeah. Like you and I know, because I went to the movies a number of times to watch the original Let It Be film. It was grainy. You could tell the band was hunkered down. You could tell the band was not enjoying it, and that was the takeaway. I remember leaving the theater after watching the original Let It Be film and thinking, God, that was a little depressing, But then the Peter Jackson version of it is a lot more brighter, uplifting, and so on. So if Get Back is the one you're going to watch, then your recollection or your idea of what that time period was all about is going to be Peter Jackson's version and not Michael Lindsay Hogg's.
So I can say a couple things from the limited shortcuts that I saw, which I assume are mostly excerpts from the overall production. I saw focus issues was the first thing that I noticed as a video editor that were impossible focus issues, which told me that what I was looking at was constructed. But I got the sense on more than one occasion with the limited view that I've had. So basically what I'm telling you is my perception here. I'm not telling you a fact that I can back, but I am telling you that it is enough of my perception that I accept that it's probably correct. That would be where I worked from, is that some of that footage was constructed by AI. And that it never happened in real life. I mean, in terms of, say, putting Billy Preston into a scene or even putting one Beatle next to the other. I noticed another thing about the colors, which of course are vibrant, as Mike said, but there is a psychological game being played with the colors, particularly the color green. We've covered this before. But lastly, here's the thing about AI that people need to know. AI can make things that you can't possibly detect or fake anymore. And here's the reason why. When we look at a photorealistic JPEG snapshot that came out of a camera that we took of our family, or a real snapshot, when that gets digitized, it's just binary code. What the AI is doing is not replicating this needs to look like this. It knows what the code is that makes a photorealistic image. Therefore, it is very easy to reverse engineer and make a duplicate that is no different. to our eyes as if it had been snapped. In other words, it can easily make a photorealistic thing that never occurred in the world. It's completely generated. That's what I'm bringing forward, but I don't want to get too stuck on this. Jason, do you want to get anything in here, or do you want me to keep this train on the track?
Well, there's an important thing to point out here. The footage for the Get Back sessions was all shot on 16 millimeter. It wasn't even shot on 35 millimeter. And if you've seen any of the new Get Back 3-part movie, it looks absolutely sensational, meaning that they used extensive software to pull that out of there. Now, I know a bit about modern color grading and filmmaking and all that, because that's just something I'm into. And you can make the colors anything you want. So if they wanted to make it look vibrant and popping, once they had digitized that 16 millimeter film and sharpened the hell out of it, which they did, they can make it look any which way they want, which is exactly what Mike is saying, that they're trying to give it a shiny new look. They're trying to skew the look of the 60s because at this point, so many people are no longer with us, and they can start rewriting history by putting out these newer films based off of the older works just by tweaking it like this.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. And I don't know about you, Mike, but when I think of that period of time, what I remember is vibrant colors. You know, we're in the tie-dye hippie. That's all coming on. And people did wear, bright colored pants and things like that, which would never be done in modern day. And I think that's being played on. But years ago, I did a thing before on Ebola, I think it was, to show that the press pool was encoding an unnatural green. It was in everything. And I noticed a similar thing going in the Jackson take. And you just told me something that really furthers my idea for myself. I didn't know he'd openly admitted that AI was going in on this.
Well, no, he didn't say about the film itself. He was saying that in his filmmaking, that utilizing AI was something that was definitely on the table.
Well, he also apparently, right before he did Get Back, there was old war scenes that were supposedly more film that no one had ever seen. And professionals in the industry took it apart to show there's two things that could go on here. You can try to accurately retell the narrative of this war footage, or you can Hollywood it and tell a tale of your own, which is what Jackson did. So there is evidence immediately before he does Get Back that he told a tale with war footage, not even being sure which side that he was portraying that the footage was showing or what nation the ship was. These things matter because the color of the uniforms, because, all the things that would identify what you're looking at in war footage. So in other words, he's already been outed telling a Hollywood tale using old war footage. And to me, it almost seems like a test run because from what I understand, he did it right before he did Get Back.
Well, also in the film, They Shall Not Grow Old, I was watching a video by a channel that they major on AI and repairing old films and stuff like that. And they said that in that film, They Shall Not Grow Old, which was a film documentary Peter Jackson did back in 2018, that there was a couple of scenes that were doctored. And I remember the channel saying, there was no need to do that. Because as soon as you do that, then what you're doing is it's no longer
history,
an accurate historical record.
Right.
So I just want to point that out too. So in any case,
I saw my gut feeling rang like a cracked bell when I saw They Will Not Grow Old, or whatever the name it was, to the point where faces were completely constructed by AI. I mean, in the one I'm referring to, I don't even know if it's the same set, but it's supposedly war footage that hadn't been seen for 50 or 60 years or whatever they're claiming. They actually even changed the background, where the trees were in the mountains, the buildings, a bunch of things. And I think it's kind of like a test run to start running out the AI. But, I know one thing. I want to bring up Harry Nilsson, because I actually saw footage of Harry Nilsson saying I was the unpaid fifth Beatle more than once or something like that. But the studio time, that's another thing where the Beatles kind of break the mold, right? I've heard accounts where, you got all your songs together and you had an hour or 2 or 3 hours and you went in and whatever you got down, that was your studio time. All of a sudden with the Beatles, that's all out the window. They have unlimited studio time.
Right. Unlimited studio time. But that doesn't mean somebody's not picking up the tab, right?
Point is, someone, even if that's true, someone is. And that, what I know. So many tales of bands saying, the studio time is expensive. And how many tales have you heard about, everyone's partying in the studio and someone in charge has to say, you guys better knock this off. This is a hell of a bill we're running up here. We're supposed to be making music. We've heard this over and over and over. But the other thing I would point out too is the LSD, and that's what ties to the United States. I've mentioned before the George Harrison, I think it's a clip, pretty sure it's either a voice recording or a clip where Harrison's saying, I'm going over to Haight-Ashbury to see all this big movement. And I get over there and there's all these spotty, drugged out kids. And he says, just by chance, we had a microscope and we had some acid. So I looked at it and it looked like a bunch of nasty, naughty ropes. And that's when I knew I was never going to do LSD again. And I'm thinking in my mind, that's a bridge too far. You've already launched this movement. But the LSD ties in to the whole narrative that's coming out of Laurel Canyon, which culminates in Manson, which changes the world, and what happened at Haight-Ashbury. So the Beatles are implicated in the early LSD induction. As a matter of fact, I think it's not Bio Paul, who is actually, you can correct me, interviewed, and he's asked directly about his LSD use.
Yeah, that's not him. That's Billy. And by the way, Billy worked with John Phillips with the Monterey Pop Festival to kick off the Summer of Love. So we've
covered what a big deal that was.
Yeah, I'm just saying LSD was huge.
Yep.
With that,
So it's another tie. But Jason, why don't you get in and I'll quit Bogart and all our time.
Well, the one thing I'm very curious about is what is the deal with the Billy's Back book? And I know it went through a couple of name changes. What's up with the author? What's the connection there? Like, how did all that get started? I don't really know the backstory to that.
Okay, so Tom Harriet is referred to as the encoder because the book is encoded. I tell folks it's 4 layers of encoding. I used to say 3, but it's really 4. So I spoke to Tom. I actually didn't speak to him, but it was email exchange. And I email periodically if I have questions to reach out about something I read in the book and I'm looking for clarification and whatnot. But Tom told me going back, maybe about 3 years ago or so, that earlier in his life, and he didn't tell me when in his life or how early, he was trained to do this encoding. And he said to me, Mike, at the time, I had no idea why it is I was being trained to do this work. And this is very typical of how the Masonic system works. It's just like a corporate system. It's a pyramid system. And so certain work has to get done, initiatives, operations, and so on. And then within their Masonic corporate structure, they have resources, people with skills. And Tom's a Freemason. He told me that he used to be a Mormon and said he left the Mormon church back in 2009 when he released the memoirs of Billy Shears. And his email to me said, but I can't say the same thing about Freemasonry. So
yeah, I thought they met on a beach.
Yeah, that's the story in the book. And the book also says that if you get the later editions, the footnote will say that that is a fictional account. So Tom is tied in, at least from the standpoint of having an important skill as a Mason, this encoding. And so when I'm giving you my take on this thing, okay? So when Billy made the decision, along with the people that he reports up through, that he was going to release this book, they had to look for the proper skills. And Tom was tapped to do the encoding. And in another email where I'd asked Tom a question, I don't remember what it was about at the time. Maybe it had to do with Phil Ackrell, but Tom wrote back and said, I have to go back to the boxes, Mike, and let me take a look at what I have there. So what that told me was that he received boxes of content, which told me that Billy's life was chronicled. Every detail about Billy was organized. And that is what Tom was working with. So it must have been a very extensive, I think, system of documenting Billy, different periods in time and different events and so on, that Tom had to pull together.
Do you know how they met? Is it later stated? Because what I read, well, it's all claimed to be fiction, but I breezed through it. They by chance met on a beach. Is there an actual story they claim is correct how they met?
No. I did ask Tom. I'd asked him at one time, again, this is going back a couple of years ago. I said, have you ever spoken to Billy in person via the phone? And he says, I can't answer that question, Mike. But it does say in the book that there are email exchanges. Billy will talk about that. The net of it is the book is a Masonic book, and the people that are involved in the book, Tom, Billy, and whoever else, they're all in the club. And Billy claims that he's putting this book out because he wants people to understand who he is, because for 56 years, that we know of. People think that a guy that passed away in 1966 is who they're looking at and is the guy that wrote all of this music, when in fact, a huge chunk of it was him. So I guess he wants us to get to know him a little better before he heads out.
The big send off. But
Yeah.
so I got to ask, the book that I got, and I'm assuming the other ones, you're told a couple things. This is fiction. That's how you know it's true. And of course, in a nonfiction book, I'm sure people would not be making the statements. But here's the point. You're told right up front, this book is encoded. And I opted not to decode it. Is there anything encoded there that matters or adds anything? Did you take the time to get through the coding? And you're saying there's like 3-4 levels.
Yeah. So the first layer of it is just read the book like you read any other book. The second layer is the word stacking. So on each page, there are bolded out letters. So when you read those letters or read those words that are bolded out, you get more information. The third layer is the acrostical code. So every other letter spells out going vertically down the page, gives you more information. And in fact, that's very tedious. Tom actually put out a small pamphlet that gives you the acrostical code and what it's telling you. So then you get even more information. The fourth layer of it is the book dropping clues, breadcrumbs, for you to go outside of the book to do additional research, to either validate the book, which is what I was doing, and or to take certain clues, hints, and to expand on what the book doesn't focus on. As an example, the book really doesn't walk away from the Lennon and McCartney songwriting team. It sticks to Lennon and McCartney being these great songwriters, although there are moments in the book when, if you pay attention, you can see and you can read that the book is telling you, hey, go look outside the book, because what I'm telling you here may not be true. And that's what I did. And in fact, it was on page 350 and 351 of a previous version of the Memoirs of Billy Shears, when it was talking about George Martin said he would take their little songs and make them great, and then started talking about the Committee of 300 and the Snitch.
Oh.
And I knew the Committee of 300 was John Coleman.
He's the snitch?
He's the snitch. He's the snitch that they were referring to in the narrative, in the book. So that's when I went out. I read the Committee of 300. I read 2 editions, the first one and then a later edition. I think there's 4 or 5 editions of the book. So that's the fourth layer. The fourth layer is inviting you to go do more research, one, to validate or to debunk what they're telling you in the book, or to take it a step further. That's how, as an example, my colleague, Sally Whitty, figured out that Billy has a prosthetic right eye.
Wow.
So Billy's blind in his right eye. And so there were certain clues in the book, along with the fact that Sally was picking up on it because she herself has a prosthetic eye. So she was watching footage of and film and video of Billy, and she noticed the way his eye was moving, that it wasn't always in sync. Both eyes weren't.
That is so occult. That is so Odin.
Yeah. So right. Odin, Horus.
Yeah.
So anyway, I said it was the most important delineation and differentiators between Billy and biological Paul, because before people were talking about the faces were different. Paul's was rounder, Billy's was longer, Billy's taller, they have different ears and so on. Well, now we've got something that we can really point to. And Billy has an artificial eye. He sees with his left, blind in his right. And I did with Sally, I did a presentation on this, and I split Billy's face in 2 to look at his left and look at his right eye. And you can see where the eyes they're not aligned properly. So if the left eye is looking straight forward, the right eye is not. Now, a lot of times when you see these videos and you're looking at him, his blind eye does move. There's a fallacy out there that if you have a prosthetic eye that it doesn't move. That's not true. It depends upon the degree in which there's damage to the eye. You can easily look this up. Lots of information on prosthetic eyes. So there's times when the eyes will move together, but there's a lot of times when you watch them very closely where the eyes do not.
Do you feel like that's the biggest discovery? Yeah. All these levels of encoding, most of it's you go out and discover other things. It's almost like an extension of energy grabbing, if you think about it. If there's really not that much offered to you, they're just taking your time again.
It's a puzzle. It's what it is. The book is a puzzle. And if you're intrepid enough, you try to find the pieces to the puzzle. But his prosthetic eye, his artificial eye, is the most important clue that we have that the guy playing Paul McCartney today is not the guy who played or was Paul McCartney back 1962 through 1966, or the guy that was in Hamburg. All the other stuff is interesting. Yes, Billy's taller. Yes, Billy has a longer face. Yes, Billy has different ears, but Billy also has an artificial eye. And if folks watch my presentation, I guess we did it about 2 months ago or so, maybe 3 months ago, it's very clear. In my mind, it's not even ambiguous. Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Do you feel like there's evidence for other Beatles being doubled?
Yeah, I mean, they all had doubles. They all had doubles and lookalikes. I had a source tell me going back a number of years ago that right out of the chute, along with each biological version of each Beatle, there were 3 doubles and lookalikes that were put into play. So if you count the biological version with the lookalikes, 4 Pauls, 4 Johns, 4 Georges, 4 Ringos. And then I did a collage of the many faces of Paul McCartney. This was going back to a lot of my earlier work that I was doing back in 2018, 17, 16, and so. And I did a presentation on John Lennon. How many John Lennons were there? You know, we have this John Lennon who had a certain nose going through 1966, and then with Sgt. Pepper, this guy with a very pinched, narrow nose emerges. Now, some people will say, well, he probably had nose surgery and so on. So I think that there's enough proof that at the very least, there were doubles and lookalikes in play. I also showed that I believe that the original John Lennon, see, there's some theories out there that say that all the Beatles died back in 1966. I don't subscribe to that. The only one that was replaced because he passed away was Paul McCartney. John Lennon made it all the way through the timeline up through 1980. And it's because I found 3 images, one of him in Hamburg, one of him as a Beatle, and then one during the double fantasy period. And it's the same person. But the net of it is lookalikes and doubles, along with image doctoring, folks, is rampant. And this was all done, especially in the case of Paul McCartney, in order to create a composite Paul McCartney, so that over time it just kind of rolls in and becomes
psychologically.
It's a big blur, right?
Well, they put that image in the middle of the album, the past, it's exactly that. Subconsciously, you're all, well, wait a minute, that looks a little bit different, but you've already assimilated. That's just a version of Paul McCartney.
On Sgt. Pepper, yeah. So you're looking at it and you're saying, well, oh, boy, he looks a little different. But then you're thinking to yourself, well, who else could it be? It has to be Paul McCartney. But the other thing they did with Sgt. Pepper was they changed the look of all of the band members. And that was done intentionally so that you would just come to the conclusion that, well, they all changed. They grew beards, mustaches, hair's a little longer, psychedelic outfits and all that stuff. It's them.
It's interesting, and I know you'll remember this. Back in the day, they were basically telling you this. Remember Mission Impossible? It was always the same thing. A world leader gets swapped out, looks exact, sounds exact.
Right.
And what they have is agents going in and taking out the real guy and then impersonating him. And they're tipping their hand, aren't they? I mean, look at Saddam. Saddam had to, who hasn't? So, yeah, it's...
Well, people, you know what it is, Crow? People are just, they're just not there.
Yeah.
I'm going to be polite about this. They're just not there. And they're still consuming the pop culture. They don't have the intrepidness to think too deep. How many people even realize that in Bewitched, Darren was switched out?
Right. Dick Sargent. What was it? Dick York?
Yeah. Yeah.
2 dicks.
Yeah. I guess there are people who noticed, but did anybody lose any sleep over it? No. They just kept rolling along. One of the biggest feathers in the cap of Tavistock had to be that they gave to themselves was after they swapped out one of the most famous identifiable entertainers in all the world, Paul McCartney, and swapped him out and really nobody noticed. A big light bulb had to go off. They had to think, wow, this is good.
I suspect it go. I saw, of all places, on TCM, it got to the point where I just couldn't watch modern entertainment. It's too violent, too program ridden. Not that the older stuff is free of it, but it's less harsh, less violent. They did this, I think it was MGM, if I remember correctly, in the 30s, and they were doing this backstage thing. And I always remembered, how good the makeup was in Wizard of Oz? All the way through the 80s, most of the makeup jobs don't even approach the makeup job that was done on The Wizard of Oz, right?
Right.
So then they were backstage and they're showing, oh, we have latex masks of everyone who's ever worked for us. And they're showing all these Mission Impossible style. And I'm thinking, why do they have that? And then I began to realize this is in the 30s. And then I began to realize not only have they had this for a long time, not only are they employing actors and doubles and all these things, they actually in the 80s downplayed what was possible for special effects. But they're, like I said, go look at Wizard of Oz. The makeup is really good. And you're thinking, oh, that was all the way back in 39. But I think this has been a known quantity since, well, clearly before even Mission Impossible. What's that? That's the 60s, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. So people just have no comprehension. Like in the example you gave about latex going back to the Wizard of Oz, we're talking 80 years ago or so.
It's crazy. And it was, at first, and what was weird is they were showing this massive, not quite cavernous room, but the number of masks was insane. And they made some comment like it's all the major players that have ever been, under contract with us. And that's when I began to realize that like a pope or a king of Spain, or I began to realize this is how they do it. They need a double. They want to swap them out. It's just crazy to think about. Anyhow, yeah. Jason, you want to get in here?
So I have wanted to know, has there been any updates or anything figured out about what would have happened to James Paul McCartney, about when it would have happened, whatever it was, and who was Billy? What was he doing before the switchover?
Okay, so biological Paul McCartney, according to memoirs, says that he died at 5 a.m. on September 11th, 1966. And what's interesting is the prevailing conspiracy narrative says it was a car crash, and memoirs in later editions starts to pull back from that, which is alluding, at least in my mind, to the fact that it was a ritual sacrifice.
Did you say September 11th?
Yeah, September 11th, 1966.
I mean, there it is. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So that's what the book tells us. Now, as far as Billy goes, Billy tells us that he was a session musician. And then, he got the nod to replace biological Paul. And this took place after Paul's death on September 11th of 1966. But that story to me is part of the fiction in the book. I believe Billy goes back way before 1966 and his involvement with the Beatles, because during the course of the book, he tells us that when he was with the Diplomats, with Denny Lane, and so on, that he was introduced to Paul McCartney, I think, back in 1962. Also in memoirs, he alludes to, through Tom, he may have been writing some of the earlier songs. In other words, he was with a band called Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots, and they did some Beatle covers. But a question that another researcher that I'm networked into, Ofer Zebi, is that the original album of Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots, there's no date where people can find when it was published, when it was released. So the question becomes, was Billy writing these songs, recording these songs as Billy Pepper and the Pepper Pots, and then they became demos that was sent over to EMI, to George Martin, for the Beatles to learn? Right? That's one scenario. I'm not saying this is what happened, but this is something that's alluded to in the book. Also, going back a couple of years ago, Billy said that as Paul McCartney, he wrote the music to In My Life. Now, In My Life was released before 1966. And then the mainstream media went into damage control, right? So I think two universities said they ran some computer modeling and all this stuff, to basically bamboozle the public and say, nope, he misremembered. That song is a John Lennon song.
How do you forget that?
And I said, in my presentation back in 2020, I said, there's no way, if you wrote the song In My Life, that you misremembered your part in writing it. It's right. Considered to be one of the greatest rock songs of all time. So what Billy was doing, in my opinion, if you go back to what he said about writing the music to In My Life, and John allegedly wrote the lyrics, well, if that's true, he was playing a part with the band before Paul died. Also in the book, he alludes to being a session player on their tracks. That's what I read into when I was reading the book. It was kind of leaning into that direction, that he was one of the session musicians that George Martin tapped.
So do you accept that Billy, replacement Paul, Billy Shears, did write actually write so much of the music that is famous. Do you accept that that's true?
I believe that Billy is an accomplished songwriter and composer, and that he wrote many of the songs that he claims that he wrote. However, I also believe that he utilized ghostwriters.
So when we see him out in public all the time, the reason it's not so groundbreaking, great musicianship is because he's fake and he's left-handed. Is that the reason for it?
Yeah, so when he plays live, he plays left-handed. And that's not he's naturally right-handed. So he had to teach himself to play lefty. And some people find that hard to believe, but there were Beatle tribute bands. I think the guy who plays bass in the Fab Four, which is a pretty famous Beatles tribute band, did that exact thing. He's right-handed and he switched and taught himself how to play left-handed. So when Billy records in the studio, he plays right-handed. In fact, a source of mine has been in the business a long time, actually has worked with Billy a couple of times, relate a story to me where he walked into the studio. I'm talking about my source. Billy was there. He was playing guitar and he was playing right-handed.
Mm.
And so my source said to him, hey, he goes, you play pretty good right-handed guitar for a lefty. And then Billy's response was, well, back in the day, there weren't a lot of left-handed guitars, so we had to learn to play both ways. It's a ridiculous story, right? Jimi Hendrix, all you do is just turn the guitar around and restring it. It's
or
not,
don't. Some people play upside down and backwards.
So I believe Billy has written a lot of his own music, but he'll claim that he's written everything. In fact, the book will say that.
Right. He's the king.
He's the king, right? But it's, Crow, that's not how the music business works. You always have to have a pipeline of material. And the only way you can really ensure that you have that pipeline is to have others contributing to the content.
So here's my problem. What I got from the early version of the book, and not all the blown out stuff that you read, is that Billy's basically saying, hey man, I did all the hard work. I snapped the whip. Everything that was made was because I'm great. So how the heck come? Look, if you are a stonemason, if you are a carpenter or a carver, as long as your body works, you get better and better and better the longer that you're in the trade. It's not true of so many musicians, and Paul McCartney is one of them. So you're telling me you wrote all this great music on Sgt. Pepper's or wherever you want to claim you wrote it. What about he comes back, he's always switching instruments too now, showing up with a weird guitar or a ukulele or something so he can fake it through, maybe lefty. But the point is the music doesn't hold a candle to what was done before. It's the same problem I had with Zeppelin. Some of that Zeppelin music, it holds up. It's probably always going to hold up. And yet, Jimmy Page hasn't done a damn thing since Zeppelin that even comes close, for the most part. And then, of course, I ran into the anger thing, where it's claimed that he had a nasty spell put on him, whether or not that's true. But at least it starts to try to answer. So what's Billy's issue? Where's all the great music, Billy, if you wrote all that?
Yeah, so this is something even that Bob Dylan spoke about. If we go back to the 60-minute interview he did with Ed Bradley said, hey, could you still write the songs that you used to write? And Dylan said, I can't do that anymore. There was a moment in time, and now, no, I can't do that stuff anymore. And, you can see Ed Bradley was a little perplexed, like, why not?
Because the Ouija board got stale.
Yeah, I believe because there is a span of time, a period of time in which, that ability is put into play based upon going to the crossroads and making that pact. Now, I do believe that Billy has done something to end up where he's at. And there's a couple of things, though, I know we're running short on time, but I want to talk about with the Beatles music and why the difference. So the 62 through 66 period, I'm convinced, was a different set of songwriters overall than what was employed between 67 and 70. And I believe what happened was back during the 62 through 66 period, George Martin, he had his crew of songwriters, Tavistock/EMI ghostwriters that were contributing.
More innocence, right? You're referring, there's more innocence in that early stuff.
There's more innocence. There's even a different style of music, if you will, right? It's just a different composition style. And then from 67 to 70, the Billy period, I believe he hired or brought in his own crew of songwriters, which could have included Harry Nilsson, could have included, which I'm pretty sure it did, Donovan.
Oh, wow.
Okay. In all likelihood, Neil Innes from the Bonzo Dog Band, also of Ruddle's fame.
Yeah.
We can go on and on and on of folks that Billy
Hired guns.
Yeah, hired guns, friends of his network, is in a circle of people that he tapped. So now you have a different set of songwriters and composers. So the songs are going to be different. And then over time, of course, what happens is once he stepped out of the Beatle box and he went solo, then things changed up. He's no longer a Beatle. He's not in the Beatles. I think that he was put in a position where, because he broke the Beatles up. Everybody thinks it was Yoko and John. It was not. He pulled the plug on the Beatles because he got tired of all the friction and the tension in the band. This is what he explains in memoirs. He pulled the plug. He had it. He couldn't deal with all of the backstabbing and all that stuff that was going on. So I think it's possible he's put in the penalty box a little bit, because then he released his first album, McCartney, and that did not get rave reviews. And in fact, in the book, when he talks about his first solo album, McCartney, he says, "I'll never do that again."
Which is pre-Wings?
Pre-Wings.
Okay.
Yep, pre-Wings.
Okay.
And then he had to reestablish himself, and then he got into the Wings thing. He reconnected with Denny Laine. He played with Denny Laine back in the days, the early 60s, with the Diplomats. He was the character Phil Ackrell. They all had stage names.
Is his name pulled? I mean, is Denny Laine in our ears and in our eyes, if you get the pun? How is that possibly so close?
Oh, Denny Laine and Penny Lane?
Yeah.
I don't know. Billy touches on that a little bit in the book, but doesn't go into any great detail. Penny Lane is an actual place in Liverpool, near Liverpool, and that it was a song that he pulled together to kind of endear himself to the local base, the Liverpudlians and stuff like that, and the locals within the UK. He didn't do a very good job, because the picture that he painted in Penny Lane, the actual Penny Lane, was actually a bit, downtrodden, if you will. So there was a big contrast between what he was portraying and singing about in the song and those who actually lived there or near there actually knew the place to be. So, but I don't know of any connection between Penny Lane and Denny Lane. But in any case, going back to, I think Billy had to reinvent himself as part of the disciplines that are in place within the pyramid of power. This is my own opinion, folks. Okay. So he pulled the plug on the Beatles. He had it. And so then it was like, all right, fine. So you're going to basically start all over again and build it up again. And he did. Even Billy has lamented about why his solo stuff. I remember reading this article years ago, and I cannot for the life of me find the source anymore. Why his solo stuff never, in his mind, stood up to his Beatle work. And then he resolves his dilemma by saying that, well, you know what? I did write some really good, pretty good songs from a solo perspective. And so I shouldn't be so hard on myself. And in fact, there are solo songs that, in my view, are great songs. I mean, Live and Let Die, Band on the Run.
Yeah, but what about Wings? How much of Wings do you feel like is because I've heard interviews where McCartney's saying, I put this band together. I'm the king. It's like his idea of he did everything for the Beatles. But with that one song where it's all guitar, the guy says, I have an idea. The guitarist says, I have an idea. And Paul says, I don't know about that. Well, finally I come around and I said, okay, we can try this guitar part, but that song is nothing without the guitar. My point being, how much of Wings is even him in the first place? Or is he surrounded by good musicians?
Well, he does surround himself with good musicians. Denny Laine is a very good musician. His solo work after Wings, he surrounded himself with studio guys. His current band is a bunch of studio guys. I don't know, Crow. I think that, he takes the credit.
He does.
How much of that credit is truly warranted? I mean, we can debate that. But evidently, the folks that he's playing with, at least to some degree, don't have a problem with it. And it's probably because they're paid really well. They're in the club, and they understand at the end of the day, this is all for a much larger cause.
Where's the great music, Paul? Remember the one he put out where the postman, there's a video, the postman comes and delivers a weird looking guitar. I forget what it is. And there's death everywhere. There's ghosts in his house. There's ghosts by a car accident on the side. Remember, do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I'm not.
It was a later release. The music is just not there. But I mean, we're getting close on time and there's so many. Let me get these last few things in.
Yeah.
There's claims that Yoko was John's handler. There's
Yes.
claim that Linda McCartney was Paul's handler. As a matter of fact, here's an odd thing, and I wonder if you remember this. When I was young and Wings had just come out, and by the way, this music is going to dominate the radio airwaves, Wings for periods of time, band on their own. They used to say that there was a joke that used, and I'm not trying to be rude to someone, I'm explaining what the public perception was. There was a joke that said, what do you call a dog with wings? And they would say Linda McCartney. In other words, the perception was not very favorable. What do you think? Are they handlers? Is there anything to all this idea that they were literally the female handlers of these folks?
Well, we'll start with Yoko first. I mean, Memoirs tells us straight up that she was John's handler, and also to a certain degree Billy, but Yoko first and foremost, because it's explained in the book that once biological Paul McCartney died, John kind of lost his way. And to kind of keep him on track, to keep him from drifting away, Yoko was brought into the picture. Now, as far as Linda goes, I honestly, I don't know. In the book, he talks very, very fondly of Linda and his love for Linda and his children. I don't know. I could tell you the thing that bugs me with Linda is her dying at 56 years old. 5 + 6 is 11, right?
Right.
I don't know. I don't like saying things like this because it's opinion and it's pure speculation. But I wonder if sometimes if Linda was part of the deal.
I have doubts.
That she departed early because of of his pact, his whatever his agreement is with what Dylan refers to as the chief commander. I don't know.
I think it's too much to overlook, but I'm with you. I don't want to badmouth. And well, before we run out of time, so early on, like whatever it was, I had my issues with something was wrong with a lot of my music, but it centered on the Beatles and whatever it was, 2012, way back sometime, I realized it's true. They did swap the most famous face in the world out right in front of us, but there was a whole story that developed at the time about the importance of the big guy. What's his name? Mel or Mal?
Mal Evans.
And they tried to say things at that time, like Mal was writing a bunch of this music, and that part of the sidetrack story, because that's when it was first starting to become a public thing again, is that he was killed because he was tired of all the music he'd written being attributed to someone else. Do you have any opinion to share with who or what or why Mal was?
Well, there's a story out there that Mal contributed to 2 songs on Sgt. Pepper. I don't know about any other songs other than these 2, Fixing a Hole and the title track Sgt. Pepper, which he assisted with. This is how the story goes. And allegedly, he was supposed to get credit for his co-authoring or his involvement in writing those songs. And of course, if that story is true, that didn't happen because if we look on the record, it says Lennon and McCartney.
Right.
Now, his death, the story behind that is, and again, folks, these are stories. There's no way of really knowing. He was writing a tell-all book, and he had a manuscript, and he was going to spill the beans. This story also applies to John Lennon, by the way, which there's speculation that Lennon was doing this as well, and that's what led to his death. But again, this is speculation, and I think it's...
What about George? Is George, because people claim that was true of George.
I don't know about George. I could say that between Lennon and George Harrison, after the Beatles broke up, the 2 of them dropped a lot of clues.
Right.
Lennon in particular was in a early 1970s Rolling Stone interview. He called McCartney a myth, the Beatles a myth. He called Dylan a myth. And then, of course, he wrote the song How Do You Sleep? And that is probably, the Paul is Dead song, where he just took a big shot at Billy. So I don't know. I think that these guys, especially, Ringo too, because he did Back Off Boogaloo and so on. I think that they had gotten to the point where they just, I don't know, they got tired of.
There are it's almost like in modern times, last 10 years or something, I'm guessing, whenever the remaining Beatles that were there at the time got together, particularly with Ringo, he is constantly dropping stuff. Like they're going to an old theater, the theater where they supposedly broke in America. And Paul goes off on this whole thing and Ringo says something like, "What are you talking about? I was actually there." And then when he at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, well, thank you for all that, Paul. Some of what you said was actually true. There's all these examples of people kind of backing him off.
Well, during the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, George Harrison said, "We loved,"
Right.
past tense, Paul.
Right.
We loved Paul. So there's that's referred to as masterfully speaking.
Yep.
Within the Masonic circles, where they can speak encoded, and they can tell a lot of truth by doing that. It's like, Denny Lane did that in an interview going back a number of years ago. I have a guy that I interviewed who was a friend of mine on Facebook when I was on Facebook 2 or 3 years ago, Walt Schnabel. And Walt used to work at a venue, and Denny Lane played there. And so after the band wrapped up, Denny was packing up his guitars. And so Walt said, "Hey," he said, "Denny, what about Billy Shears? What about Billy Shepherd?" And Denny said, "Who?" And so Walt said, "Come on, Denny, you know what I'm talking about." He goes, "Oh, you mean Billy McCartney?" So this is what they do. They all know, and they can drop their clues in their own little way to put it out there.
Jimmy Page recently did basically a verbatim masterful speak about this.
Well, when he was at Oxford, he did a speech at Oxford, Jimmy Page. They asked him about the backmasking on the songs.
Right.
And Page denied it. But of course, if you play Stairway to Heaven backwards, I mean, it's very clear. It's not even ambiguous. They're praising Satan. During that response to the gal who asked the question, Jimmy Page said, "And Paul is dead." It's the way he emphasized.
And he says, "I'm serious." He says, "Paul is dead. I'm serious."
Right. And he said, "I just want to be part of all things shiny and bright," which is Lucifer, right? That's what he says during that
Hail
Oxford.
Satan.
That's what he says during that Oxford lecture. It's right there, but it's the way he called out, "And Paul is dead." I have that in a presentation as well. But Crow, people watch that stuff. It goes right over their heads. Or if you point it out, they think you're a nut job. They think you're crazy. You're just reading into things, Mike.
Because they don't know how to think yet. They want things to be the way they want. Masterful speaking works on a mind that wants things to be the way they want it to be.
Right.
Because if you actually type out what's just been said and you divorce yourself that you ever saw it and just read this back, then you can see how it works. But the problem is then you go watch it again and you're back to, that's not the way I want the world to work.
Right.
And so it's crazy. So look, by the way, I want to invite you back again. We'd love to have you back again. I wish we had more time than we have, but as a cap on what we've just done, the reason I've gone at this so many times is because it was damaging. The overall result of what happened has paved the way for where we are teetering right now. It's all part of, there is no separating any of it. And if you want to be honest, can you think of something that changed the world culturally and just take the yearly off that? So you say cult. If culturally there was a bigger change than the Beatles, what was it? And even if you can think of something, you've got to admit this is big and it's mostly worldwide, even to the point where they're attributing the fall of the Russian Empire was partially because of Beatles music. On and on it goes.
That's right. Billy said he played in Russia, right? So that was
first band in. And by the way, we helped knock communism down. Right. When actually what we're looking at is a version of communism coming on now. It's openly stated. But my point is, this was damaging and we paid. There's two kinds of programming that went on. And in an episode we're about to do, that's going to be about Moon Manson and Woodstock, to show how a programming timeline is put together over time. There's the programming you pay for, which is what we've been talking about. I love the Beatles. I paid to go see their concert. I paid for their T-shirts, their merch, their albums. And then there's the programming you don't pay for. That's the evening news. That's other things that, and by the way, the ones you don't pay for tend to hit like a bomb and change things much more rapidly, where the things you do pay for have a huge effect over time. What would you say? Do you agree with me that this was all a psychological operation and it succeeded more than can be dreamed for?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What was it that we lost?
What we lost was we lost being grounded, having that foundation of traditional values. Now, when you talk about traditional values today, Crow, a lot of people just shrug it off. Oh, that's just so old-fashioned.
It is now. There's no lie in that statement, but they have no idea what they're talking about or what's been lost.
But what people have to understand is that the dismantling of the natural order has landed you where we are today. So what I do is I tell folks, let's use 1960 as a stake in the ground. And let's fast forward to 2022, 60 years. Those of us who have been around long enough will easily acknowledge that the level of transformation and change has been unbelievable and not for the better. It's just,
It's overwhelming.
it's overwhelming. It really is. And, you know, the uphill battle that you have, I have, Jason has, all of us have, that are trying to get the word out, trying to get the truth out, trying to explain what is going on here. It's a monumental task. It's huge. And the Beatles played a gigantic part in it. And that's, folks, that's very, very hard for me to say because I grew up with them.
Soundtrack of your life, right? I mean, we're talking about the soundtrack of our lives here.
Yep.
The Beatles are the biggest sacred cow, I would say.
Oh, let me tell you something. I'll vouch for that because if you can only imagine the amount of hate that comes my way whenever I talk about this. So when you guys post this and, and stuff like that, put your seatbelts on because there are going to be a lot of people that are just going to be going out of their minds.
Well, this isn't the first time we've whipped out the sniper, but the truth of it is, and there were points, years ago when I thought, well, I'm really starting to take control of my own life. I'll be immune to this programming. No, you're not. No, I'm not. No, I never will be unless I get so much more spiritually advanced than I view myself as now.
Yep.
Penny Lane is still in my ears and in my eyes, and it always will be. I can't unknow that. I can't undo. It is what it is. But to recognize what's actually been done, and what's even sadder is, when I got to James Shelby Downard and others, there's a good possibility that what we've managed to do here is revelation of method.
Yeah, and it's not just the Beatles, Crow. So, I mean,
Right.
We have so many genres of music, and each genre is targeted to a specific generation, a specific part of the population. And all of these genres of music are all interconnected, folks.
That's why we're about to do Moon Manson Woodstock. We're talking about a murderer that changed culture in ways that you can't even fathom if you weren't alive back then. In one of the hottest summers that you can remember, almost like the weather was tied to it. We're talking about NASA. They do stuff with space, right? That's not connected. And then we're talking about Woodstock on the other side of it. It's all the same thread. And as a matter of fact, there is no separating any of the ideas that we're about to cover that I just laid down that doesn't stretch back to everything we've talked to today. There is all a programming thread that makes up what we call culture, which we might as well just quit calling culture. We just call it a cult. Call it what it is. It's manufactured. True culture is the elders of a society handing down things that are important,
right,
that need to be known by the next generation. And that includes what they've learned in their lifetime and what they were handed from their parents. That is not what we've had in my lifetime. There is no culture. What I recognize as culture in the world that I grew up in, where I live, is I like some movies and I watch some TV. And by the way, I love music. That's what culture has been in my lifetime, mostly. But with that, Jason, I bogarted. You knew what was going to happen. Is there anything you want to get in before we wrap up here with Mike?
Yeah, I've got two last points for everyone to think about. There's a short clip you can find easily on YouTube where Graham Nash says something to the effect of, "There are people who think that Paul McCartney was in Wings."
Right.
The other one is, how good of a piano player was James Paul McCartney? Because, man, there's some pretty good piano playing later on, isn't there?
That's right. Well, George Martin played virtually all of the piano and keyboard work before 1967. Then after that, Billy did the piano work.
I wonder if Billy has a coat of arms. He must, right?
He does, but the problem is we don't know his true last name. The book says Shepherd. Some people think it's Campbell. That's why I use Shears, because that's the name he gives us on Sgt. Pepper. Let me introduce to you Billy Shears, right? So I just stick with Shears, and I don't get into the surname debate because it's just running around in circles.
Mike, thanks so much for coming by. I know Rose is going to ask you to come back on again. We can catch up. Maybe we can skew the conversation so that it's not completely centered on what we just did. Jason and I were talking the other night, and I had to say it because what always happens, what's going to happen when this goes live, is someone's going to say, "How dare you or more likely they'll say, well, maybe that was the Beatles, but this other band that I love, they were completely innocent in all this. And what I said to Jason was the other night, I said, do you even dare to take a look at Dark Side of the Moon? You know, I said, because I tell you exactly what you're going to find. And I even said to Jason, even though there's actual footage of them working on the music, I can already see the fingerprints of what we are going to find. And part of me knows that for an album to be on top for that long, it has to have the nod.
This is what I recommend to everybody. Okay. So if you think that I'm nuts, Crrow's nuts, Jason's nuts, about how the music industry really works, there's 3 documentaries I highly recommend. The Wrecking Crew. That's how the music industry worked in the 1960s and 70s. Watch Muscle Shoals, released in 2013. Muscle Shoals was doing in Alabama what the Wrecking Crew was doing on the West Coast and in some cases on the East Coast. The third documentary to watch is Hired Gun. And that takes you from 1980 going forward. You watch those 3 documentaries and you will have a very good understanding of what the music industry is really about and how it really works, how those records get recorded.
I would make another bold statement. I don't know. Jason's heard me say it. Here's another construct band constructed from the ground up called Lynyrd Skynyrd, who invented basically or is credited with the Southern genre. But I will quote one of their most famous songs. Muscle Shoals has the Swampers, and they've been known to do a song or two.
That's right.
They tell you right in it. Anyhow, Mike, please tell folks where they can find you one more time.
Yes. So, folks, my hub website, Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY, sageofquay.com. All of my links are there. It's one-stop shop. And that's where you can find me.
All right, perfect. Well, let's throw a couple emails before us old guys are gone and there's no one around to remember, way back then. If we have you on again, we should round it up and think of an interesting thing that we can deliver partially by dint of age and partially, research and other things. But Jason, anything else you want to add in?
Mike, thanks for the time, by the way. I've wanted to talk to you about this subject matter for ages, so looking forward to part 2.
You're very welcome, guys. Anytime.
All right, perfect. Everybody listening, that is the end of hour 2 of episode 481. This has been Jason Lindgren and Mike Williams, also known online as the Sage of Quay. With that, I will bid you all adieu, and I would like to wish each and every one of you in the entirety of this world a happy, healthy, and higher-minded new era. Cheers.